Let's raise public investment. And to do that, the government needs revenues. So we need tax revenues as well as getting the PPP framework and the investment climate right. Another area I just want to emphasize because it's relevant to lots of things brought up today. On the labor front, as I showed you, unit labor costs are fairly competitive. So now the issue is not really only about the wage level, but it's also what are the indicators we are struggling in. If you look at another area, I think it's nice to look at it from the World Economic Forum, is that you see where Philippines somewhat falls behind. For example, there was a mention today about hiring and firing workers. That's an area, because after 6 months somebody becomes permanent, it's very hard to fire. What happens in the Philippines? Everybody has temporary contracts. Most of the labor employment growth in the Philippines today is temporary contracts because of the rigid labor laws. So I would say, if you look at the labor market reform, what do we need to focus on? Increasing flexibility. I think Arangkada has idea of apprenticeships, could be a very positive thing for youth unemployment. So I think looking at these indices, you get ideas of what are the critical reforms we need to do in the Philippines to not only invest, but also have the complementary reforms to facilitate stronger and more inclusive growth. Thank you. I was quick and hopefully it was short. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Paris. And may we request that you take your seat on one of the chairs for the panel discussion. To start the panel discussion, let us welcome the moderator of our second panel, the Chief Executive Officer of Ronin Consultancy Services, as he introduces his panelists that will join him to discuss the topic of high employment generating sectors. He has worked in the securities industry, media, and the public sector, where he was Secretary of Residential Communications, Development, and Strategic Planning for the Aquino administration for 3 years. He was president of the investigative journalism magazine, Newsbreak, before joining ABS-CBN, where he produced and anchored news shows. He is also a consultant at the First Philippine Consultancy Holdings. Everyone, the moderator for the next panel, Mr. Ricky Carandang.
Good morning, everyone. I know we're running a little bit late. I also know that it's almost close to lunchtime. I've been advised by the organizers to be a little bit disciplined with the time. So with your indulgence, I will do that. Let me just introduce our panelists. Dr. Shanaka Jayanath Perez, resident representative of the IMF. We've just heard from him, and he's done a great job of kicking off the macro view of our discussions. We'll also be joined in the panel by our expert from the manufacturing sector, Mr. Robert Batumbakal. He's chairman of the Manufacturing Committee at AmCham and country director of Dow Chemical Pacific Limited. Our expert in the tourism sector is Mr. Ludwig Ryder, co-founder of the Asia Pacific Projects and a consultant of the USAID Compete project. Our expert for the agribusiness sector is Mr. John Gregory DiQuino, a management development consultant and executive director of the National Competitive Council Agri-Trading Logistics Working Group. And our expert for the mining sector is Mr. Johan Radsma, trustee and vice president of the Philippines Mining and Exploration Association. Good morning, everyone. Let's start by giving an overview. We've gotten the macro point, the macro view. Let's go into the sectors that we've mentioned. I'm going to give you guys about 2 minutes, if it's possible, to just briefly talk about what the sector has accomplished, what are the challenges that remain, and what might you recommend in order to move us to the next level. Let's begin with Mr. Batumbakal.
Good morning, Ricky. Good morning, everyone. I am so pleased to be invited here again. It is my 4th chance to be in this panel. And when I reflect about the past 4 years, of it starting in 2011, it was almost sheer optimism to talk about manufacturing back then. There's a lot of doubt. There's a lot of raised eyebrows about what we're talking about. But the past 4 years we've seen significant growth in manufacturing. Last year, it grew 8.1%. The previous year was 10.3%, and then prior to that was about 5.4%. But what do these numbers tell us? 2 things. we may not realize that with those numbers, that makes our manufacturing sector the fastest in ASEAN 6. Okay? Second, is that those numbers enable the manufacturing sector to outgrow in growth rate the service sectors in the past 8 quarters. And that's very important. We're not saying that services should slow down, not at all. But what we're saying is that the much awaited structural adjustment is happening. And now we're talking about coming to 4 years already. So that is very encouraging. A few more things I want to mention is that what is our manufacturing compared to the rest of the world? Well, we looked at the numbers. It's actually 24th largest out of 214 countries. That makes it top quartile performance when you compare it to the rest of the world. But talking about labor, which is the key topic in this forum, is that manufacturing productivity has actually been accelerating. What do I mean? In the previous, in 2000 to 2009, manufacturing labor productivity was only rising 2% per annum. Now, the past few years, it is already rising at positive 4% per annum. That is very encouraging. So, with that, if I do have a second round, I'd like to share more. Thank you, Ricky.
Thank you. Do you want to go briefly, though, Mr. Batumbakal, into the challenges? I mean, we've seen manufacturing come back.
Yes.
Clearly, it's back.
Okay.
But what, very briefly, would be the challenges that the sector faces?
Okay. Good question. In spite of the rapid growth, I think last year was probably one of the more challenging in recent years because of the port congestion. We had almost a whole year everybody blaming each other. Suppliers blaming, producers blaming suppliers, blaming their brokers, blaming their freight companies, and blaming government. It was a very difficult period for the manufacturers. And yet, imagine, we still delivered 8.1% growth. Imagine where we could have been without the port congestion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Port congestion. There was just a press release this morning that said that was over, but anyway, we can discuss that later. Tourism sector, Mr. Ryder.
Thank you very much.
I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Karandang, very good to see you there. To begin with, looking at the Arangkada accomplishments on tourism, we see that about 90% of the 32 recommendations made there remain to be completed after 4 years. So whilst there's been a lot of progress, it's been very slow. No? And that's also reflected in the metrics that we see. So for example, between 2011 and 2014, the total number of additional international arrivals that this country received was a mere 500,000. So in other words, from 4.3 million in 2011 to 4.8 million in 2014 is a fairly flat line type performance. And I think that reflects some of the issues that Arangkada is trying to address. Accessibility, access infrastructure, connectivity, destination infrastructure, the cost of doing business, the cost of services, for example, carrier services. And we've had a number of successes in being able to roll back taxes. For example, the other one, of course, that's very important, is the ability to get back to Category 1 under the FAA for our airports, and of course the rollback of the ban from European skies of some Philippine carriers, not all, I should mention, we're not quite there yet. So whilst we've had a number of successes, the reality is that we are still moving more or less sideways in terms of the major metrics for tourism. Now, international tourism is important because it is actually the major value add. There is a large domestic tourism flow in the country, but in a way, it's really moving wealth from one part of the country to another. And that's important because inclusive tourism, that gives actually tourism its inclusive characteristics, the ability to transfer wealth from the well-to-do areas, such as Metro Manila, to the less well-to-do areas. And tourism is very much a rural activity as opposed to a city activity. So I think it's very important to understand. So as we look at the accomplishments, we see that facilitating tourism enterprise zones and upgrading tourism infrastructure and access are the recommendations that have not really progressed very much. Only recently have we begun to talk about getting our airports organized, for example, the Mactan Cebu International Airport PPP, or cleaning up the act in NAIA, for example. But the reality is that we have major congestions. You can only put 40 landings and takeoffs per hour through NAIA. And for 18 hours of the day, that's about the number. So the growth coming out of NAIA in terms of international arrivals is quite poor, 1 or 2% over the last couple of years. So you can see that we're quite challenged in terms of being able to get the kind of volumes we've been talking about. And not surprisingly, the cost of traveling to the Philippines is expensive. If you're from Tokyo going to a three-night, 4-day holiday, beach holiday, you can go to Boracay or you can go to Phuket. The cost of going to Phuket is half the price of doing the same things to the Philippines, but we are only halfway there. So just to give you an idea, between Thailand and Tokyo, there are about 25,000 seats a week. Between us and then there are about 12,000 seats a week. So obviously, if you don't have the seats, you really don't have the pricing either, and that's something that makes us very, very difficult to compete. So in terms of the inclusive growth, obviously we need to address these types of challenges. We need to make sure that the infrastructure bottlenecks, the transportation, the airports, the water, the energy, and even the last mile road access, especially in the rural areas, are addressed. We need to make sure that and bear down on policies and administrative procedures that inhibit inclusive tourism growth, such as air transportation, visa arrangements, road transportation services, costs of starting and operating a business, and taxes. For example, we still have taxes. I don't know whether you are familiar with this, but for a Filipino to leave his country, it's going to cost $48. Travel tax plus the terminal fee at NAIA. If you're a foreigner, it's going to cost you almost $100 because you're going to also spend on travel tax, the terminal fee, and $2,170 if you're a regular resident departing. So if you're a foreign investor here, it's actually fairly expensive business to move in and out of this country on a regular basis. So there we are still some way from getting, I think, these issues correct. Removing obstacles to better linking tourism opportunities to less economically advantaged local communities is also something that we need to think much more carefully about. And that's about giving them access, sanitation, energy, social infrastructure, community knowledge, skills, credit, and extension support. Okay. So how do we make tourism more inclusive? My apologies. Accelerate investment in access, destination, and community-based infrastructure in the poorer tourism development areas to connect and facilitate participation in the tourism supply chain. Secondly, double efforts to remove policy administrative barriers to inclusive tourism growth. Thirdly, strengthen programs to encourage product development that links the gateway TDAs with the less developed and poorer development areas and increase promotion of these and the products to make them more inclusive. There are a number of other issues. For example, we need to pay more attention to climate change. And of course, most importantly, the issue of peace and security and safety are very, very important. And we would very strongly call for a continuation of the peace process in Mindanao and as well as with other conflicts. So those are some of the key things that I think going forward we need to address to get tourism to a point where it can take off in the way that I think we envisaged 4 years ago under the Arangkada project. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone from DOT is here, but my good friend Mig Sagkal from DOTC is here. You might want to speak up a little bit later on and address some of the infrastructure-related points. Let's move on very quickly to Mr. Dicino to talk about agribusiness. Mr. Perez said earlier in his discussion that there was not enough investment in agriculture. So let's hear it from one of the participants in the sector. Is your mic working? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. 2 years ago, the National Competitiveness Council created the Agri-Trade Logistics Working Group. in order to come up with recommendations to improve the competitiveness of the agribusiness sector of the Philippines. At that time, the urgency was already mentioned because of AFTA 2015. Today is March 3, 2015. And are we ready to compete in the ASEAN market, including the Philippine market? Well, the answer is yes and no. To be sure, there are pockets of competitive firms in the Philippine landscape who have gotten their business models right. The Philippine producers of bananas, pineapples, yellow corn, some coconuts, some sugar, some cacao, some high-value crops have found the formula to make their investments work and work properly. They have looked into all the components of the value chain, from production, land, labor, planting materials, irrigation, agri-inputs, credit, and working with landowners, both aggregated land holdings and smallholders, which, working with landowners is a technology all unto itself in the Philippines, to logistics, roads, ports, shipping, to markets, packaging, value-added downstream products, market research, presence in foreign and local markets, clear government-to-government protocols, including phytosanitary regulations, which may become the main barrier to achieving free trade, per se. In the case of the traditional competitive Philippine agri-products, the firms invested in all these requirements themselves. Thus, their investments were and are large. For a $1 million investment in banana production, for example, the resulting direct farm-level employment, meaning a meaningful job in agriculture, is 1.5 people per hectare of farmland. There is, of course, indirect employment created in the other parts of the value chain, or probably a multiplier of 25 additional employment. In the case of yellow corn, success has been achieved also as a result of the value chain approach adopted by the firms in this sector. Under the leadership of the Corn Board, which is a public-private sector organization with active participation of the Department of Agriculture, all the member companies, including producers, farmers' cooperatives, seed companies, fertilizer companies, shippers, silo storage players, mills, hog producers, which is four-legged corn, poultry producers, which is two-legged corn, tackled particular issues along the value chain and arrived at their solutions. Thus, their roadmap was accomplished with ease precisely because they looked at their sector from the point of view of competitiveness. And competitiveness can be attained in all parts along the value chain which they have analyzed. So talking about the roadmaps, Mr. Del Rosario mentioned also that one of Arangkada's main recommendations to achieve inclusive growth is to immediately formulate and implement roadmaps for specific subsectors in agriculture, and to support these roadmaps with adequate investments to increase agricultural productivity, low mentioned by the IMF representative, and to improve the welfare of our farmers and fisher folk. In creating these roadmaps, achieving competitiveness is the main objective, and the value chain is thoroughly analyzed vis-a-vis other competitive countries also to identify areas of competitiveness which we can capitalize on. There were 20 roadmaps, I think, that were commissioned by the Department of Agriculture, and 5 of them have been completed to date, with the 15 others in various stages of completion, around 80-85% complete. So our theme this year in Arangkada is to invest now for inclusive growth. So these roadmaps in various stages of completion will help us identify where to invest per crop, per value chain component. What comes to mind now to achieve agricultural productivity are investments in seeds, production methodologies which will improve agricultural productivity. Comes to mind is what the New Zealand ambassador said earlier, the dairy development project, which is really an improvement which will increase the productivity of the dairy farm sector. Now, aside from value chain analysis, another framework to consider when looking to invest for inclusive growth is the convergence initiative from ridge to reef, which is mentioned in the Philippine Medium-Term Development Plan as its main strategy, one of its main strategies to achieve inclusive growth. The convergence refers to converged efforts of the DA, DAR, and the DENR in collaboration with the LGU concerned and the private sector. The target beneficiaries are those in the peripheries, forest dwellers, upland farmers, coastal communities. The approach is by biodistrict, that's the involvement of DNR, which is the lead agency. So there is a sustainable green development perspective also. Investments through this program will thus be probably in the area of tree crops, tree plantations, interspersed with coffee, cacao, in the forest, upland probably, and fish cages, for example, in the local coastal communities. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dikino. Next, Mr. Radsma to talk to us about mining.
Yes, mining. Good morning. Responsible minerals development is probably the most inclusive industry that we know of. I'm actually very honored to be sitting next to John Gregory here from agriculture, because agriculture and mining are inclusive. Mining is all based upon finite resources, whilst agriculture is a spin-off, partly responsible for sustainable development, and could not happen without mining. As I was looking at the Forbes, the top list of the new billionaires in the world that came out today, I was glancing, looking for my name, couldn't find it. But I did see that the top 10, 20 billionaires in the world, led by, of course, Bill Gates, all, and actually none of them were in the mining business, but all of them were dependent on responsible minerals development. You know, whether it's phones or telco or industrialists, etc. So mining has had it's had a bit of a slow start in the early days here in the Philippines. From 1950s to the 1980s, the growth of mining was at about 6 or 8% per annum. And it provided for a substantial amount of gross domestic product for the Philippines. Now, you got to remember at that time, it was easy to measure these things on a macro level, but on a micro level, there just wasn't enough data for the direct and indirect employment from responsible mining, as well as the economics that flowed through to other industries, was difficult to measure. Mining peaked in 1970s to where it was about 24% of the Philippine export. And for those in the hall that would remember it, in those days, mining companies basically dominated the Philippine Stock Exchange. From the 80s, actually 70s, 80s to currently, there were hiccups. And there were some roadblocks. Some of them are basically not related to the Philippines, like Asia financial crisis, 2008 global financial crisis. All of these impact mining adversely, and thus the ability to grow. Mining needs a long period for development. This is not something that you can turn around, or you can turn it off and then turn it on again with the next administration. Responsible minerals development needs sustainability. It just needs that kind of growth. So we had a bit of a kick in 2010, where there was an increase in metals prices all throughout the world. Mining produced, I think it contributed somewhere between 5 and 6% of the export value of the Philippines. And then we've had a slowdown in recent prices, but also in new projects. Under Executive Order 79, there were very few projects that actually got started, and there was very little exploration conducted over that time. The big thing about mining is that it has enormous potential. And this is, the reason why I say that is because if you compare Philippines mining industry with other countries that are less geologically endowed, and I don't even want to compare it with Australia and Canada and the US, which are the front runners. But if you compare it with Chile and Peru, where in 2010 those countries exported, mining contributed about 50 to 60% of the export value. Chile is somewhat in many ways a similar country, similar dynamics. Chile had 1.5% of employment compared to the Philippines, less than 0.5%. Now, on a macro level, these are interesting, but on a micro level, there's a whole new development. And the mining industry has done several analysis with the University of Asia Pacific and University of Canberra on several projects here in the Philippines. And based upon the forecast of these projects, a single large project, and I'm not even talking about the largest project that everybody's talking about, which is Tampakan, but a single large project like a porphyry copper, which is really what all this Philippines is, would contribute to about 0.9% of GDP. It would reduce unemployment, national unemployment, by 5%. That means that 1 in every 20 people that does not have a job today would have a job because of direct and indirect impacts of mining. And these numbers are much, much higher when you look at these projects on a regional level.
Okay, I'm going to open the floor to questions now. You can ask your questions by standing up and going to a microphone, which I will give priority to. If you're too shy to do that, you can take a piece of paper on the table, pass it on to one of the ushers, and they can pass it on to me. Or you can text your question to 0929-560-7051. So we've kicked off the discussion. Interesting observation is that when we talked about agriculture and mining, we talked about how rich in resources the country was. And yet, both of the gentlemen talking about those topics were really talking perspective. This is what could happen if we do it. This is what could happen if we get the investment. Contrast that to tourism and manufacturing, which aren't really as critical in terms of natural resources, and yet they're doing very well, relatively well. So there's a little bit of an irony there.
Yeah. Ricky, I think that's an interesting point, which really points out that the opportunity to rapidly grow a sector like manufacturing is pretty much limitless because we do have the people resource. We have a big upside. There's about 11 million farmers and there's only 3 million manufacturers. So we do have a lot of resource of shifting these people towards this industry.
So what do we need? I mean, if you were to point to one thing, Mr. Dicino, that you think could increase investments in agriculture, what would it be? One thing. I know that's overly simplistic, but given the lack of time.
Investments. At the NCC, the 3 things that we identified in our working group was the improved access to credit, better logistics, and continuation of the anti-smuggling campaign.